Hello! We are so excited to show you our native speech capabilities. Welcome back to the English journey. Today, we are elevating our conversation beyond the basics to discuss the architecture of a typical day from a high-level perspective. My name is Anna, and I am here to guide you through the nuanced vocabulary and idiomatic expressions that characterize native-level fluency.
And I am Abel, and I am so glad to be here with you, Anna. At this level, it is no longer just about communicating facts. It is about conveying the subtle textures of our experiences and the complexity of our thoughts. Today, we want to explore how to narrate your daily life with the precision and flair of a C1 level speaker.
Exactly, Abel. And I think the best place to begin is at the very beginning, the morning. Most learners, when asked to describe their day, will say something like, I woke up at 7, I had breakfast, and then I went to work. Now, there is absolutely nothing incorrect about those sentences. They are grammatically sound and perfectly intelligible. But what they lack is texture. They lack the quality of immersion that makes a listener feel as though they are living alongside you moment by moment.
That is such a precise observation, Anna. And I find it fascinating because the morning, for me personally, is perhaps the richest part of the day in terms of sensory and psychological experience. I rarely spring out of bed as though I've been launched from a catapult. It is more of a gradual surfacing. There's a wonderful expression in English to drift in and out of consciousness, and that is exactly what happens to me in those first 10 or 15 minutes. I'm hovering somewhere between wakefulness and the residue of dreams. And my mind is extraordinarily fertile in that liminal space.
I love that you use the word liminal, Abel. That's a sophisticated and increasingly common word in intellectual English discourse. It refers to a transitional state, a threshold between two conditions. And that in-between space you're describing, that drowsy semi-awareness, is something every human being experiences, but very few people in any language have the vocabulary to articulate precisely. In English, we might also say we are groggy, which is that heavy, slightly disoriented feeling, or we might describe the morning light as filtering through the curtains, which gives a sense of graduality, of things unfolding gently rather than all at once.
Precisely. And it's interesting because how you narrate your morning actually says a great deal about your relationship with time itself. I tend to be quite deliberate in the morning. I wouldn't call myself a morning person in the enthusiastic, energetic sense of the phrase, but I have cultivated what I would describe as a mindful morning ritual. I make my coffee, and I should say I'm quite particular about this. I grind my own beans, I use a pour-over method, and there's something almost meditative about that process. It demands a kind of focused attention that eases me into the cognitive demands of the day without overwhelming me.
What you're describing is a beautiful example of what psychologists call anchoring behaviors, small, consistent actions that serve as psychological anchors, grounding you in the present moment and signaling to your brain that a transition is underway. And the language you can use to describe this is wonderfully varied. You might say you eased into the day, or that your morning routine sets the tone for everything that follows. You could say you're laying the groundwork for your focus, or that these rituals help you hit the ground running once the working hours truly begin.
I also want to mention something I do that I think is rather unconventional. I spend approximately 15 minutes in what I call reflective silence after my coffee. No phone, no news, no notifications. I simply sit with my thoughts. And I find that this practice, which I admittedly stumbled upon rather than deliberately chose, has had a profound impact on my mental clarity throughout the day. It's as though I'm allowing the sediment of sleep to settle before I stir the water again.
That metaphor is absolutely exquisite, Abel, allowing the sediment to settle. That's precisely the kind of figurative language that distinguishes a truly fluent speaker from someone who is merely proficient. At the C1 level, we stop relying exclusively on literal description, and we begin to reach for metaphor, analogy, and imagery to convey abstract internal experiences. The morning, in this sense, is not just a time of day, it's a psychological landscape, and learning to describe it as such is a significant step forward in one's narrative sophistication.
Now, after that period of quiet, I typically begin what I think of as my mental preparation phase. I review my priorities for the day, not in a rigidly structured corporate sense, but more as an act of intentional foresight. I ask myself, what are the 2 or 3 things that, if accomplished today, would make me feel genuinely satisfied? And I hold those in mind as a kind of compass. Then I get ready, and I head out for what I genuinely think of as one of the more philosophically interesting parts of my day, the commute.
Oh, the commute. Now, this is something that most people dismiss as dead time, a frustrating, uneventful gap between the home and the destination. But I think if you approach it with the right disposition, the commute is an extraordinarily rich microcosm of society. It is, in many ways, a moving theater of human behavior. On any given morning journey, you might observe the full spectrum of human emotional states compressed into a single carriage or a single bus: exhaustion, anticipation, boredom, anxiety, quiet contentment.
Absolutely. And what strikes me every single morning without fail is how people manage, or perhaps more accurately, how they mismanage the tension between public and private space. You see it most vividly in the way people use their phones. Some people are completely absorbed, scrolling with an almost frantic intensity, as though they're searching for something they can't quite name. Others are listening to music with their eyes closed, entirely self-contained, creating an invisible perimeter of personal space in an inherently shared environment.
That's a wonderfully astute observation, and it raises an important point about vocabulary, the vocabulary of social observation. At the C1 level, we move beyond saying people were on their phones to offering an interpretive layer. We say things like, the collective absorption in digital screens created an atmosphere of disconnected togetherness, or the carriage was simultaneously full and profoundly solitary.
I also use my commute quite deliberately as a time for either deep listening. I tend toward long-form podcasts and audiobooks on particularly stimulating mornings, or for what I would call ambient observation, where I simply allow the environment to wash over me without actively processing it. The latter sounds passive, but it's actually a form of mental rest that I've come to value enormously. It's a way of arriving at my destination without having already depleted a significant portion of my cognitive reserves.
And that brings us beautifully to the concept of cognitive load, which is a term borrowed from educational psychology, but has entered the broader vocabulary of productivity and self-management discourse. Cognitive load refers to the total amount of mental effort being used in the working memory at any given time. When we talk about feeling mentally drained or stretched thin, what we're really describing is an excessive cognitive load. And one of the most important skills at any level, not just in English but in life, is learning to manage it proactively rather than reactively.
I think that segues perfectly into the conversation about deep work and the flow state, which is something I am genuinely passionate about. I work in a field that requires sustained, uninterrupted concentration, the kind of thinking that cannot be done in 5-minute intervals between email notifications. And I have spent a considerable amount of time experimenting with the conditions under which I do my best work.
This is such a rich area, Abel. For our listeners, the concept of flow was popularized by the Hungarian-American psychologist Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, and it refers to a state of complete absorption in a challenging task, a state in which you lose track of time, your self-consciousness diminishes, and your performance reaches its peak. People describe flow as one of the intrinsically rewarding human experiences, and the fascinating thing is that it's not reserved for artists or athletes. It's available to anyone engaged in meaningful, challenging work.
That is exactly right, and I can tell you from my own experience that achieving flow is not simply a matter of sitting down and deciding to concentrate. It requires a very deliberate architecture of conditions. First, the task itself must be appropriately challenging, not so easy that it produces boredom, and not so difficult that it produces anxiety. There's a sweet spot, a kind of cognitive Goldilocks zone, where the challenge is perfectly calibrated to your skill level. That calibration is what unlocks the gate to flow.
The metaphor of a gate is very apt, and there are other architectural elements as well. The elimination of distraction is paramount, and I use the word paramount deliberately because it means of supreme importance, above all other considerations. Research consistently demonstrates that it takes an average of 23 minutes to fully regain focus after an interruption. 23 minutes. So each time we reach for our phone, each time we allow a notification to pull our attention away, we are not losing 30 seconds. We are potentially losing nearly half an hour of genuinely productive cognitive engagement.
That statistic genuinely astonishes me every time I hear it, and I've heard it many times. And yet, even knowing it intellectually, I find myself inadvertently succumbing to the pull of digital interruption with a frequency that is rather humbling. I think what makes it so insidious is that the interruptions are designed to feel rewarding. There is a dopaminergic loop, a cycle of anticipation and small reward that makes checking notifications feel productive even when it is categorically not.
And this is why the language we use to describe our relationship with technology matters so much. There is a significant difference between saying, I was distracted by my phone, which frames you as a passive victim, and saying, I found myself surrendering to the compulsive pull of digital interruption, which is more honest, more sophisticated, and ultimately more empowering because it acknowledges agency. The moment you recognize a pattern with precision, you are in a far better position to disrupt it.
On the days when I do manage to achieve flow, and they're not every day, I want to be honest about that, there is an almost physical quality to the experience. Time becomes elastic. I will sit down intending to work for 45 minutes and look up to discover that nearly 3 hours have passed. My thinking feels unusually clear, almost crystalline. Connections between ideas emerge spontaneously, and there's a kind of quiet exhilaration in the work itself. Not the frantic excitement of novelty, but the deep, sustaining satisfaction of doing something difficult well.
That description is extraordinary, Abel, and I want to pause on it for a moment because what you have just done is something our listeners should study carefully. You used a sequence of varied sentence structures, short declarative statements alternating with longer, more complex clauses. You used sensory language, like crystalline and elastic, the idea of connections emerging spontaneously. You did not simply tell us what flow feels like, you created a linguistic experience of it. That is storytelling at its most sophisticated.
Thank you, Anna. I think the afternoon is where the day becomes more socially complex for most people, and certainly for me. The morning has a certain solitary quality to it, but by midday I am deeply embedded in the social ecosystem of my workplace. And navigating that ecosystem requires a very different set of linguistic and interpersonal skills.
Absolutely. And the vocabulary of social interaction at the workplace is one of the areas where even very advanced learners can feel uncertain. It is one thing to describe your morning routine, it is quite another to articulate the subtle dynamics of a team meeting, the undercurrents of a difficult conversation with a colleague, or the particular art of giving feedback that is honest without being damaging. These are areas where vocabulary, tone, and what linguists call pragmatic competence, the ability to use language appropriately in context, all converge.
I had a fascinating and rather challenging interpersonal moment today, actually. There was a meeting in which a colleague of mine, a very capable and well-intentioned person, I should say, presented an idea that I felt had some significant structural weaknesses, and I was in the position of having to respond in a way that was candid but not dismissive, critical but not deflating. It required what I think of as diplomatic precision, a very careful calibration of every word.
That is such a relatable scenario, Abel, and it speaks to something quite profound about high-level English use in professional contexts. The instinct of a less experienced speaker might be to soften their critiques so much that it loses all content, or conversely, to be blunt in a way that inadvertently damages the relationship. The skilled communicator finds a middle path, using what linguists sometimes call face-saving language, which acknowledges the other person's intelligence and effort even while redirecting their thinking.
Exactly. I found myself saying things like, I think there is something genuinely compelling at the core of this idea, and I wonder if we might be able to strengthen the framework by addressing the question of, And what that does is it leads with affirmation, which signals respect, before introducing the challenge. It also uses the word wonder, which creates a spirit of collaborative inquiry rather than adversarial critique. These are not manipulative tactics, they are the linguistic tools of a thoughtful communicator.
And I would add that reading social cues in these moments is equally critical. There is a whole vocabulary in English for describing the nonverbal dimension of communication, the way someone's posture tightens, the way a silence can be loaded with unspoken meaning, the way a smile can be strained rather than genuine. When you can narrate these subtleties, you demonstrate a level of social intelligence that is genuinely impressive to native speakers.
The afternoon also brought an unexpected setback, which I think is worth discussing because setbacks are an inevitable feature of any working day, and the language we use to describe them has a remarkable power to shape how we experience them emotionally and cognitively. I discovered quite late in the day that a project I had been working on for several weeks had a fundamental flaw in its initial assumptions, a flaw that required me to essentially dismantle and rebuild a significant portion of the work.
And how did you respond to that in the moment, Abel?
Honestly, my first internal response was something close to despair. That sinking, hollow feeling of effort rendered temporarily futile. But I have learned, through both experience and deliberate practice, to create a kind of mental buffer between my initial emotional reaction and my subsequent response. I gave myself approximately 5 minutes to simply feel the frustration, without acting on it, without catastrophizing, without spiraling into a narrative of failure. And then, I made a deliberate shift in the way I was framing the situation to myself.
That is a beautifully articulated description of emotional regulation. And the language of resilience in English is rich and worth exploring. We can describe setbacks as a necessary recalibration rather than a failure. We can say that an error revealed something important rather than proved something wrong. We can frame the need to redo work as an opportunity to build something more robust on a sounder foundation, rather than as wasted effort. These are not mere euphemisms. They are genuine alternative interpretations of reality, and the framing you choose has real consequences for your motivation, your creativity, and your ultimate output.
I wholeheartedly agree. And there is a wonderful idiom in English that captures this philosophy rather elegantly: to go back to the drawing board. It sounds like defeat, and in some contexts it is used as such, but it can also be reclaimed as a statement of resourcefulness. The drawing board is where creativity lives. Returning to it is not regression, it is an act of intellectual courage and craftsmanship.
I also love the expression "to weather the storm," implying that difficulties are meteorological in nature, transient, and ultimately survivable. Or to find your footing after being destabilized, which carries a beautiful implication of gradual, deliberate recovery rather than sudden transformation. Resilient language does not deny difficulty. It contextualizes it within a larger narrative of capability and progress.
By the time the late afternoon arrived, I had made meaningful progress on the restructured project, and that initial sense of despair had been largely transmuted. I like that word, transmuted, with its almost alchemical suggestion of transformation into something that felt more like quiet determination. And I think that arc, from disruption to equilibrium, is one of the most important stories a person can tell about their working day, because it is honest and it is human.
It is deeply human, and that arc, as you call it, is also an arc of narrative. It has tension, a low point, and a form of resolution. When you structure your account of a difficult day in that way, with that dramatic shape, you are not just reporting events, you're telling a story. And stories are the fundamental unit of human communication. They are how we make sense of our experience and how we connect with other people.
As the evening arrived and the working day concluded, I found myself in what I think of as the transitional hour, that period between the end of structured work and the beginning of genuine personal time, which can be surprisingly difficult to navigate. There's often a residual mental hum, a kind of cognitive afterglow from the intensity of the day, And if you simply collapse in front of a screen without allowing for a proper transition, the evening can slip away without having truly rested.
The transitional hour is such an evocative phrase, and it points to something that is increasingly recognized in the literature on well-being and productivity, the importance of what is sometimes called a shutdown ritual. The idea is that just as the morning requires a ritual of gradual engagement, the evening requires an equally intentional ritual of disengagement. Without it, the boundary between work and personal life becomes dangerously porous, and we find ourselves neither fully working nor fully resting, existing in a kind of perpetual cognitive limbo.
My own shutdown ritual has evolved over time. I now make a point of spending at least 20 minutes in what I loosely call analog activity, something that does not involve a screen. Sometimes it's cooking, which I find genuinely therapeutic in its combination of sensory engagement and practical creativity. Sometimes it's a walk, which has the dual benefit of physical movement and perceptual novelty. The simple act of noticing the world around me, the quality of the evening light, the sounds of the neighborhood, the gradual cooling of the air.
What you're describing is sometimes referred to as soft fascination in the attention restoration literature, a mode of gentle, effortless engagement with the environment that allows the directed attention we use for work to replenish itself. It's the opposite of the forced, effortful concentration of deep work, and it's equally essential. The human attentional system is not designed for unrelenting focus. It requires oscillation between intensity and ease, between the exertion of concentration and the restoration of wandering.
And then there is the evening itself, the winding down, the unplugging, the gradual movement toward the quiet of night. I have become increasingly deliberate about the last hour before sleep, treating it almost as a sacred space. I avoid news, I limit the emotionally stimulating content I consume, and I try to spend at least some time in what I can only describe as introspective conversation with myself, a kind of gentle audit of the day. Not in a self-critical or analytical way, but in a spirit of curious reflection.
I find that genuinely moving, Abel, and I think it connects to one of the most underrated forms of linguistic sophistication, the vocabulary of introspection. Being able to articulate what you are grateful for, what you learned, what you wish you had done differently, and what you are looking forward to, all of this requires a kind of inward fluency that is distinct from the outward fluency we typically associate with language learning. It requires honesty, nuance, and a willingness to sit with complexity rather than resolve it prematurely into simple categories.
I sometimes end my day by mentally constructing a single sentence that captures its essential quality. Not a summary of events, but an impression, an emotional or atmospheric distillation. Today, for instance, I might say, it was a day of unexpected turbulence that resolved into a quiet but genuine sense of forward momentum. That sentence contains the setback, the recovery, and the emotional tone of the resolution. It is not dramatic, but it is true, and I think truth told with precision is always more interesting than drama told imprecisely.
That is a profoundly beautiful statement to reflect on, and it brings me to what I want to say about the art of narrative style itself, because we have touched on it throughout our conversation, but I want to address it directly. One of the most common observations that native English speakers make about advanced learners is that they can communicate accurately but monotonously, that their sentences tend toward a uniform structure and length that, while entirely correct, lacks the rhythmic variety that makes spoken language compelling. True fluency is as much about rhythm as it is about vocabulary.
That resonates deeply. I think about this constantly in my own speaking. I try to be conscious of varying my sentence architecture, using a short, punchy statement to land an important point, then following it with a longer, more complex sentence that develops the idea, then perhaps a rhetorical question to invite reflection, then a metaphor to make it vivid. That kind of orchestration, and I use that word deliberately because it implies both intention and musicality, is what gives sophisticated speech its texture.
And the transition words and discourse markers play an enormous role in this. The difference between also, moreover, and what is more is not just semantic, it is tonal. Moreover, has a certain formality and weight that is appropriate in some contexts and pompous in others. What is more, has a slightly more conversational quality that can be very effective in natural speech. Understanding these gradations is a mark of genuine mastery. Similarly, expressions like that said, and yet, even so, and by the same token, allow you to introduce counterpoints and complications in a way that feels sophisticated rather than contradictory.
I also think about the power of specificity, the difference between saying, I had a difficult conversation at work, and I found myself carefully navigating a conversation in which I had to balance candor with tact, all while reading the subtle shifts in my colleague's expression for signs of how my words were landing. That difference is the difference between reporting and storytelling. The first sentence conveys information. The second creates an experience.
And that ultimately is the destination towards which all language learning is traveling, the ability to create experiences in the mind of the listener. When you describe your day not merely as a sequence of events, but as a landscape of meaning, of feeling, of insight and difficulty and small triumphs, you are doing something remarkable. You are using language as it was always meant to be used, not merely as a vehicle for information transfer, but as a medium of genuine human connection.
I think what I take away from today's conversation, and what I hope our listeners will take away, is that describing your day is not a simple or low-stakes exercise. It is one of the most demanding and rewarding challenges in language acquisition. Because your day is not a list of facts, it is a living, breathing narrative composed of sensory details, psychological states, social negotiations, moments of joy and frustration, and the constant, quiet effort to make sense of your experience. To tell that story well, in all its texture and complexity, is the highest aspiration of the fluent speaker.
Eloquently stated, Abel. And to our listeners, the details are not embellishments that you add to your English once you have mastered the fundamentals. The details are the fundamentals at the advanced level. The capacity to describe the quality of morning light, the emotional topology of a difficult afternoon, the quiet restoration of an evening walk, these are not decorative flourishes. They are the architecture of authentic communication, and they represent the final, most rewarding bridge between proficient English and the kind of deeply resonant fluency that makes a native speaker stop and truly listen.
That is the journey, and it is one worth taking with patience, with curiosity, and with the willingness to find something remarkable in even the most ordinary of days, because the most ordinary of days, described with precision and care, turns out to be anything but ordinary.